Rain swept across the Idaho hills, erasing the trees and turning the broken earth into a dark mouth of mud. Michael Bennett lay inside an abandoned mine passage, his left leg pinned beneath a rotted beam. Every movement made the timber groan. Daisy pressed against his shoulder, trembling but refusing to leave. Far above, lightning revealed Cooper at the shattered rim of the opening, his paws slipping in the rain-softened ground. Michael lifted one shaking arm. "Cooper, find Thomas." The young German shepherd froze. He had never been ordered to leave Daisy or sent into darkness without Michael walking somewhere ahead of him. "Go!" Michael shouted. Cooper stared down for one terrible second, then turned and vanished into the storm. But could Cooper find Thomas before the collapsing mine claimed Michael and Daisy forever? Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances. 3 weeks earlier, Michael stood in the kitchen of an apartment that looked borrowed. There were no photographs on the walls, no curtains over the windows, and no second chair at the narrow table. 6 cardboard boxes remained sealed beside the door, though he had lived there for 11 months. At 56, the former Navy SEAL still stood a little over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders and solid in the arms. Short, dark brown hair, silvered at the temples, framed a square face covered by close gray-brown stubble. His blue-gray eyes moved automatically from the dripping faucet to the hallway and the only exit. Years in uniform had taught him to study every room. The years afterward had taught him to leave before anyone expected him to stay. His phone rang beside the sink. Linda Parker, the attorney handling his late grandfather's estate, spoke with careful precision. Michael remembered her as a slim, 61-year-old woman with fair skin, neatly cut silver hair, rectangular glasses, and a calm manner shaped by decades of settling family disputes. She was kind without becoming sentimental and never used pity when simple honesty would do. "The court filed the final documents," she said. "The property outside Wallace is legally yours." "The cabin, too?" Michael asked. "The cabin, livestock shed, access road, and 40 acres. But the house has been empty almost 8 years. The roof was already deteriorating during the last inspection." A child ran across the apartment above him. The quick pounding tightened Michael's shoulders before reason caught up. For one heartbeat, it became boots inside a metal corridor and a voice counting men who would not all return. Then it was only a child again. "I'll manage," he said. Linda paused. "Your grandfather kept that hill long after it stopped making financial sense." "Most things he kept stopped making financial sense." "That may have included certain members of his family." Michael almost smiled. Linda's dry humor never demanded laughter. It merely left the door open for it. 3 days later, Michael left with 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, and no one to call goodbye. Since leaving military service, he had worked security, repaired heavy equipment, and hauled freight at night. Jobs temporary enough that no one asked why he slept with his boots beside the bed or parked his truck facing the road. People called him independent. Michael had begun to suspect independence was loneliness with better posture. He told himself the inherited hill would offer peace, but what he truly wanted was a place remote enough that nobody would notice how completely he had withdrawn. Near dusk, rain followed him into northern Idaho, and he stopped at a roadside feed store for fuel and coffee. The long, corrugated building stood beside a gravel lot crowded with fencing rolls, seed pallets, and faded farm trucks. Beneath an awning at the far end sat 2 transport crates beside a hand-painted sign. "Working shepherds seeking a home." The female in the first crate watched Michael without approaching. Daisy was 8 months old, slender but strong, with a honey-gold face, a deep charcoal saddle, and amber eyes that followed every hand crossing the lot. One ear stood upright while the other angled outward whenever the wind rattled the sign. She did not seem timid. She seemed careful, as though trust were a doorway she preferred to inspect before entering. The male in the neighboring crate had no such patience. Cooper, her 8-month-old brother, was slightly larger, black across the back with warm tan along his chest and legs. His right ear stood straight while the left folded at the tip, giving him a permanently curious expression. He paced twice, sat, stood again, and pushed his nose between the bars as if every closed door were a personal insult. "Looking for a dog?" asked an older man nearby. Frank Miller was 68, long-faced and weathered, with thick white hair, a drooping mustache, and clear blue eyes that softened whenever they rested on the shepherd's. Arthritis had damaged his right hip, forcing him to lean on a polished hickory cane. It had made him slower, but not bitter. Frank had raised sheep and working dogs for 40 years and offered animals a tenderness he rarely displayed toward people. "One," Michael said. "For a house or work?" "Both. I inherited some land. Might keep sheep later." Frank tapped his cane against the gravel. "Eventually is the safest way to own sheep." Michael looked at him. Frank remained solemn. "That was humor. I was afraid of that." Frank opened a folder containing vaccination records and veterinary reports. Daisy and Cooper were littermates from working lines, raised around barns, machinery, and livestock. They understood basic commands but had not completed formal herding training. "I'm selling the farm," Frank said. "This hip won't carry me through another winter. The sheep already have buyers. These two need more than somebody's backyard." His voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened around the folder. Michael recognized the effort required to surrender something without turning the loss into a performance. He crouched before Daisy's crate, keeping his hands visible. She leaned forward, smelled his knuckles through the bars, then sat back and studied him. She thought before moving. Michael understood that language. "I'll take her." Frank attached a lead and opened the crate. Daisy stepped down slowly, her body cautious but not submissive. Michael accepted the leash. One dog was practical. One food bill, one set of veterinary expenses, one animal to train, and one living thing whose absence might someday hurt. He had become skilled at limiting such possibilities. Frank turned to close the crate, metal scraped behind them. Cooper had pushed one front paw beneath his door until his claws touched the wet gravel. Daisy stopped. Michael gave the leash a gentle pull, but she did not follow. Cooper made a low sound, not quite a bark and not quite a whine. Daisy's ears lowered. She turned completely around and stepped back toward her brother. "They ever been separated?" Michael asked. Frank looked toward the rain. "Not overnight. Born 11 minutes apart. Neither one has slept without hearing the other breathe." "You could have said that first. Then you might think I was selling a story instead of dogs." Cooper's paw remained beneath the door. A dusty road rose inside Michael's memory. A vehicle pulling away, men being counted, one wounded teammate left beyond the haze while orders demanded movement. The man had later been recovered alive, but Michael still remembered the empty place beside him during the retreat. He remembered staring at it while telling himself that following orders and abandoning someone were not the same thing. He had spent years believing survival required clean decisions, carry what could be carried, leave what could not, never turn around. Only later had he understood that some rules saved the body by slowly starving the soul. Daisy took another step toward Cooper. Michael loosened his grip on the leash. He had driven to Idaho seeking a life in which nothing depended on him, yet here he was calculating whether two frightened animals would suffer because one dog fit more neatly into his plans. Practicality had protected him for years. It had also left 6 unopened boxes beside an apartment door and no one expecting a goodbye. "How much for both?" he asked. Frank studied him for a moment, then named an honest price. Together they secured the 2 crates in the pickup bed, covered them against the rain, and left enough space for fresh air. Michael checked every strap twice. Frank noticed but said nothing. Before closing Daisy's crate, the older man rested one rough hand against her head. His expression changed only slightly, yet the cost of parting with them showed in the way his thumb lingered between her ears. "Right choices have poor manners," Frank said quietly. "They rarely feel right while you're making them." Michael pulled away as evening settled over the road. Cooper shifted constantly behind him, his folded ear appearing and disappearing through the rear window. Daisy sat motionless. Michael had driven alone for so many years that silence had become part of the engine's sound. Now he heard claws adjusting against the crate floors, collar tags softly rattling, and two young animals breathing behind him. The highway narrowed as the hills gathered close. Darkness swallowed the wet forest one ridge at a time. Michael checked the mirror. Cooper had finally settled. Daisy had not. She was no longer watching the road behind them or the man inside the cab. Her amber eyes remained fixed toward the north, beyond the trees and the last visible ridge. Then a sound traveled through the night, low, distant, and too deep to be thunder. The steering wheel trembled beneath Michael's hands. Daisy rose inside her crate and stared toward the unseen hill as though something beneath the earth had called her name. By the time Michael reached the final turnoff, darkness had swallowed the road behind him. The strange vibration beneath the steering wheel had stopped, and the forest had returned to silence. But Daisy remained standing inside her crate, watching the northern ridge until the trees closed around the truck. The access road was little more than two muddy tracks buried beneath wet leaves and thorny brush. Michael engaged four-wheel drive and continued uphill, stopping twice to cut fallen branches before the headlights finally revealed the cabin. It stood in a small clearing like an old animal too stubborn to lie down. Gray boards leaned beneath a damaged roof. One rear window had lost its glass, and the left side of the porch sagged toward the ground. Behind it, the livestock shed had almost disappeared beneath vines. Broken fence posts emerged from the weeds at uneven intervals, some upright, others tilted like exhausted sentries. Michael switched off the engine and listened. Water dripped from the branches. Cooper shifted impatiently in his crate, but Daisy remained quiet. The house did not look as though it had been waiting for him. It looked as though it had simply failed to collapse before he arrived. Michael left both dogs secured while he inspected the clearing. He tested the porch steps from the side, checked beneath the cabin for visible damage, and walked the perimeter with a flashlight held low. His movements followed habits older than the gray in his hair. Examine exits, identify unstable ground, never stand directly in front of a closed door. The larger key Linda had given him resisted until he worked oil into the rusted lock. When it finally turned, the sound echoed through the empty house like a bone breaking. Dust moved across the floorboards as Michael entered. The main room held a wood stove, a scarred table, two mismatched chairs, and a narrow bed beneath a stained canvas cover. Water had darkened part of the ceiling, and mouse droppings marked one corner, but the central beam still appeared sound. The rear room was worse. Rain had entered through the broken window and softened the boards below it. Michael tied the door shut so neither dog could wander inside, then checked the chimney, the kitchen pump, and every section of flooring capable of carrying weight. The hand pump produced only a hollow wheeze. He would have to use the water stored in the truck. Outside, he found 4 portable fence panels half buried behind the shed. Their lower edges were rusted, but the frames remained strong. He dragged them beside the porch, wired them together, and closed the gaps with boards pulled from a fallen section of fence. The enclosure was ugly, but it was secure. Only then did he lower the ramp from the truck. Daisy descended first, keeping her body low while her amber eyes measured the clearing. Cooper bounded down after her, reached the end of his lead, reversed direction, and nearly wrapped himself around Michael's legs. Once inside the enclosure, he discovered a rusted bucket and struck it with one paw. The bucket rolled downhill with a scraping clang. Cooper leaped backward, barked at it, then approached and struck it again. A laugh escaped Michael before he could stop it. The sound felt unfamiliar in his chest. Daisy looked toward him, surprised. Cooper hit the bucket a third time, apparently encouraged by success. Michael led the dogs into the cabin, one at a time. Daisy remained near the center of the room, watching both the doorway and Michael without committing herself to either. Cooper inspected everything with reckless enthusiasm, pushed his head beneath the table, found a dry leaf, carried it across the floor as though it were treasure, and finally fell asleep under the table with the leaf between his paws. Michael heated canned stew on a camp stove and divided the dog food Frank had packed into 2 metal bowls. Daisy waited until he stepped away before eating. Cooper did not. Rain returned near midnight, tapping first against the roof and then falling hard enough to find every weakness Michael had missed. He placed metal pans beneath the leaks and lay on the old mattress with his boots beside the bed. He did not trust the chimney enough to light the stove, so the cabin grew colder as the storm deepened. Sleep came in fragments. When the nightmare found him, it arrived as red light against metal walls, a voice repeating coordinates, and the face of a man he had been ordered to leave behind. Michael woke with one hand reaching toward the floor for a weapon that was no longer there. His fingers struck bare wood. He held himself still, breathing through the panic until the room returned around him. Daisy stood several feet away, her eyes reflecting a thin amber glow. She did not approach. Cooper remained asleep beneath the table, his paws twitching. No miraculous bond had formed because Michael had paid for them and brought them up a hill. He found the honesty of that almost comforting. Trust was not gratitude. It was repetition. Food arriving when promised, hands that did not strike, doors that opened again, and a voice remaining steady when something broke. Morning entered through the gaps around the plywood Michael had nailed over the rear window. He took the dogs outside, filled 2 bowls, and placed them just inside the cabin. Then he opened the enclosure gate while keeping both leads loose in his hands. The pickup and transport crates remained nearby. If the dogs preferred the road, he would not force them to remain in a damaged house merely because he had decided they belonged there. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "There will be food here, dry ground eventually, and no more closed crates." Daisy looked toward the truck, then toward the open doorway. Michael stepped aside rather than blocking her path. After several seconds, she entered the cabin. Cooper noticed one of Michael's work gloves beside the porch, seized it, and ran after her. 2 trails of muddy paw prints crossed the floor Michael had swept the night before. One ended near the bed. The other made an unnecessary circle around the table before disappearing beneath it. Michael stood in the doorway, feeling something loosen inside him. Not peace, not yet, but perhaps the absence of immediate retreat. As he reached to close the door, his flashlight passed over faint marks cut into the bedroom frame. Dates and initials had been written beside each line in faded pencil. Near the middle was a short mark labeled MB, 12. Michael placed his palm against it. He remembered standing there barefoot while his grandfather balanced a carpenter's level across his head. The old man had been broad and stern, with heavy hands, iron-gray hair, and a voice that could frighten sheep through a closed wall, yet he had hidden peppermint candies in his coat pocket for Michael and repaired every broken toy without admitting it mattered. When 12-year-old Michael had risen onto his toes, his grandfather had pressed him flat and accused him of fraud against the family record. The memory brought back sawdust, vegetable stew, and rain crossing a roof that had not leaked. Michael had thought the hill belonged to his grandfather. He had forgotten that a small part of his own life had once belonged to the hill. The following afternoon, Michael was clearing brush from the lower access trail when an old green pickup appeared between the trees. Its passenger door was cream instead of green, as though borrowed from another truck and never properly introduced. The driver stopped several yards away and climbed out carrying a steel thermos. Thomas Reed was 65, shorter than Michael but thick through the chest, with work-built arms, a nearly bald head bordered by close gray hair, and a square face softened by pale blue eyes. His nose had been broken long ago and healed slightly crooked, while a neatly trimmed gray beard covered his jaw. He wore brown overalls beneath a dark green jacket patched at one elbow. Thomas had spent most of his life farming the southern slope, and years of losing friends who refused assistance had made him impatient with pride. He was generous in a manner that allowed no one to call him generous. "You're Edwin Bennett's grandson," he said. Michael kept one hand near Daisy's lead. "That obvious. You have his habit of standing in the road while deciding whether a man is worth speaking to." Thomas lifted the thermos as though proving he carried no weapon. He had known Michael's grandfather for more than 20 years and remembered both the old man's sheep and the language he used whenever machinery failed. Without asking permission, Thomas unloaded a manual post driver, fencing wire, a pry bar, and several pieces of second-hand lumber. "I don't need charity," Michael said. "Good," Thomas replied. "I'm not charitable. These were taking up space." He nodded toward the sagging porch. "Southwest support is failing. I saw it." "Then we agree." Thomas returned the next morning with roofing sheets and mixed plumbing fittings. He worked without giving orders, and Michael accepted the help without thanking him often enough to make either man uncomfortable. Their conversations remained brief, dry, and strangely warm. Thomas showed him where the old drainage ditch had filled with roots and helped to brace the porch while Michael replaced the weakest boards. Cooper decided Thomas was trustworthy after discovering dog biscuits in his jacket pocket. Daisy took longer. She stayed where Michael remained within sight, especially when loud tools were used. On the fourth day, Michael was pulling old wire from a thorn thicket when Daisy gave a short, sharp cry. She stood several yards away with her front paw raised. A long thorn had entered between two pale toes. Michael crouched but did not seize her leg. Daisy's body tightened as he placed one open hand on the ground between them. "It has to come out," he said quietly. Her gaze moved from his face to his fingers. Michael waited. He had learned in another life that fear became more dangerous when cornered. At last, Daisy lowered the injured paw near his palm. Only then did he touch her ankle. She trembled, but did not pull away. Michael removed the thorn, checked for fragments, cleaned the puncture, and wrapped the paw loosely. When he finished, Daisy remained beside him. Then, with careful deliberation, she placed the bandaged paw on the toe of his brown boot. The weight was almost nothing, yet Michael felt it more deeply than any command she had obeyed. He had expected trust to arrive as loyalty or protection. He had forgotten that sometimes it arrived as permission. That night, the rain finally stopped. Thomas's truck had disappeared down the southern road. Cooper slept beneath the table with one of Michael's gloves tucked under his chin, and Daisy rested near the porch doorway. Michael sat outside with a metal cup of coffee warming his hands. The repaired portion of roof no longer leaked, but the cabin still smelled of wet wood, dust, and years without breath. Daisy suddenly raised her head. She did not look toward the forest. Instead, she lowered her muzzle and pressed one ear against the porch boards. Michael watched her body become perfectly still. The air had gone quiet. No wind moved through the branches. On the table beside him, the metal cup trembled once against the wood. The cup stopped trembling before Michael could touch it. Daisy remained with one ear pressed to the porch boards, her body so still that even Cooper paused beneath the table and watched her. Michael stepped outside, tested the nearest support post, then walked to the edge of the clearing with a flashlight, but the ground looked unchanged beneath the wet leaves. No trees had fallen. No wind moved through the forest. When he returned, Daisy had lifted her head, though her attention remained fixed towards the northern slope. Michael told himself the vibration had come from settling timber. The cabin had been empty nearly 8 years. Old houses shifted, wet soil moved, and tired men often heard danger where none existed. Still, the following morning he inspected the porch again before beginning work on the livestock shed. Over the next 10 days, he and Thomas replaced warped boards, cleared the vines from the western wall, reopened the drainage channel, and repaired a smaller holding pen beside the main enclosure. The shed never became beautiful. It became strong enough to use, which Thomas insisted was the more honest achievement. "Pretty buildings collapse just as efficiently as ugly ones," he said while tightening a gate hinge. Michael had learned that accepting Thomas's help required pretending no help was being offered. Thomas arrived with old lumber because it was cluttering the truck, brought plumbing fittings because the mice had expressed no interest, and repaired a water trough because watching you do it wrong would take longer. Michael stopped arguing. That change unsettled him more than he admitted. For years, every favor had felt like a debt waiting to be collected. Thomas treated assistance like passing a hammer across a workbench. Useful, temporary, and too ordinary to deserve ceremony. When the shed was ready, Thomas drove Michael to a small farm east of Wallace. They returned near noon with 2 young ewes secured inside a livestock crate. Rosie was 6 months old, compact and bold, with thick cream-colored fleece, a narrow dark face, and bright black eyes that examined every object as a possible source of food. A reddish patch marked the wool above her left knee, making her easy to recognize at a distance. June, 5 months old, was slightly smaller and more delicate, with softer white fleece, a pale gray muzzle, and long ears that turned toward sounds before the rest of her body followed. Where Rosie pushed forward, June watched first. Michael recognized the contrast immediately. It reminded him uncomfortably of Cooper and Daisy. The 2 shepherds waited at the gate as the pickup climbed the final bend. Cooper raced ahead, tail striking the fence while Daisy approached with measured interest. Michael attached their leads before Thomas opened the livestock crate. Rosie announced herself with a sharp, indignant bleat. Cooper launched backward so quickly that his hind legs slid beneath him. He struck Daisy's shoulder, regained his footing, and ran toward the cabin with the dignity of a wheelbarrow rolling downhill. Daisy retreated behind Michael's left leg, peering around him at the 2 animals that were less than half her size. Thomas folded his arms. "These are the guardians? They're evaluating the threat." Rosie stretched her neck toward Cooper and bleated again. Cooper looked deliberately toward the sky, pretending the sound had come from somewhere else. Thomas laughed until he had to rest one hand against the gate. Michael tried not to join him, but the sight of a black and tan working dog hiding from a lamb finally broke through his control. Daisy glanced up at him, startled by the sound, while Cooper returned cautiously and sat beside Michael as if he had never left. Michael refused to rush the introduction. Rosie and June remained inside the holding pen while Daisy and Cooper observed from outside on long leads. When either dog became tense, Michael increased the distance. When they watched quietly, he rewarded them. Rosie tested every corner of the enclosure and tried to chew the cuff of Michael's jacket whenever he leaned over the rail. June stayed several steps behind her, though she followed wherever Rosie went. Cooper wanted to investigate everything at once. During the first exercise, Michael directed him across an opening between 2 fence panels. Cooper understood the direction, but not moderation. He sprinted past June, skidded through the straw, and stopped only when Rosie lowered her head and stepped toward him. Cooper took 1 step back. Rosie advanced again. Cooper looked at Michael with a wounded expression, then sat and turned his head away, as though refusing to acknowledge the ewe might cause her to disappear. "Stopping is also a skill," Thomas said. "He disagrees. Then he has something in common with most young men." Daisy learned differently. She studied the sheep's breathing, the movement of their ears, and the rhythm of their hooves. At first, she remained partly behind Michael, but by the 4th morning she stood at his side. June approached the fence and extended her muzzle between the wires. Daisy's shoulders tightened. Michael gave no command and did not shorten her lead. After several seconds, Daisy leaned forward and touched her nose to June's. The contact lasted barely a heartbeat. June returned to the hay. Daisy remained in place. Michael looked down at her and understood that courage was not the absence of retreat. Sometimes it was the decision not to use it. Cooper's training required a different approach. His speed and enthusiasm made him useful, but only if he learned that movement needed a destination. Michael began turning a simple search exercise into a game. Thomas would hide somewhere inside the enclosed property while Michael held Cooper by the collar. "Find Thomas," Michael said the first time. Cooper exploded forward, ran past the shed, circled the porch, and raced straight beyond Thomas, who stood near the woodpile. The dog ignored him entirely and buried his nose in the pocket of Thomas's jacket, searching for biscuits. "Technically, he found the important part of me," Thomas said. Michael repeated the exercise several days later while Thomas repaired fencing farther down the southern slope. This time, Cooper stopped at the first crossing path, lowered his nose, and followed the older man's trail through wet grass. Michael watched from the upper gate, resisting the urge to call directions. Cooper briefly lost the scent near a drainage ditch, circled back, then disappeared behind a stand of young pine. A moment later, Thomas's voice traveled uphill. "He found me. Unfortunately, he also found the biscuits." Cooper returned beside him, folded ear-bouncing pride in every step. Thomas handed Michael the lead. "One day that foolish command may save somebody's life." It's a game. Most useful things begin that way. The days settled into a rhythm Michael had not planned. Morning feeding, fence checks, short training sessions, repairs, and evenings beside the stove. Daisy began sleeping closer to his bed. When nightmares woke him, she no longer watched from across the room. She stood beside the mattress and rested her chin on its edge, waiting without demanding to be touched. Michael would place one hand between her ears until his breathing slowed. Cooper usually slept beneath the table, surrounded by objects he had stolen and apparently categorized as valuable: a glove, a pine cone, one of Thomas's socks, and a length of cloth that Michael had never identified. The cabin changed around them. Fresh boards replaced rot, smoke rose cleanly from the chimney, and 2 dog bowls stood beneath the kitchen shelf. Michael began driving into Wallace without planning his visits for the quietest hours. He spoke to the feed store clerk about hay, answered an elderly woman's question about his grandfather, and remained in the conversation even after politeness permitted him to leave. One evening he called Frank Miller. "Someone dead?" Frank asked after answering. "No." "Then this must be social." Michael watched Cooper dragging a feed sack toward the porch while Daisy lay near the lamb enclosure. "They're adjusting." "Both?" "Daisy thinks before she moves. Cooper moves before thinking becomes necessary." Frank laughed softly. Michael told him about the sheep, the training, and Daisy's growing confidence. Before ending the call, Frank said, "Sounds like they landed where they needed to be." Michael looked at the cabin's repaired window and, for once, did not hear those words as a burden. The next morning, Daisy did not come when Michael called her for breakfast. He found her at the northern fence, standing perfectly still with her muzzle lowered toward the ground. 3 posts that had been upright the previous day now leaned toward the woods. The wire sagged between them, and a narrow crack ran from the base of the center post down the slope between exposed roots. Michael stopped several yards away. Daisy moved forward until her lead tightened. "Back." She obeyed immediately, but her eyes remained fixed on the depression. Michael did not cross the fence or test the soil with his boot. He photographed the area, tied bright survey ribbon across the approach, and moved both dogs and the sheep into the southern enclosure. Only then did he carry Linda's wooden box to the kitchen table. The brass-repaired corner caught the morning light as he unlocked it. Inside were deeds, tax records, old surveys, and a yellowed map covered with thin black lines beneath the contours of the hill. The property had once been marked as a silver prospect. Several lines ended at rectangles labeled Vent and Access Shaft. Beneath the map lay a cracked leather ledger written in his grandfather's heavy block letters. One sentence had been underlined twice. "If the north fence begins to sink, do not cross. Move the livestock south. Mark the ground and call the county." Michael placed one hand on the map. Outside the kitchen window, the earth beside the northern fence split again, and a fresh black line opened slowly down the hillside. The new crack outside the kitchen window widened by less than an inch, but Michael treated it as if the entire hillside had opened. He moved Daisy and Cooper into the southern enclosure, secured Rosie and June inside the reinforced holding pen, then photographed the damaged fence from several safe angles without crossing the survey ribbon. The yellowed mind map lay open on the kitchen table beside his grandfather's ledger. Thin lines marked old tunnels beneath the northern slope, and one narrow route ended almost directly below the leaning fence posts. Michael called the county land management office and was transferred twice before reaching David Collins, the civil engineer responsible for abandoned mining hazards in that part of Idaho. David was 48, lean and long-limbed with close-cropped sandy hair, a narrow face, and a short beard several shades darker than the hair on his head. His calm hazel eyes and measured voice came from 20 years spent entering places where panic could kill faster than unstable ground. A collapse early in his career had buried a survey partner for 6 hours. The man survived, but David had never again softened a warning merely to make someone feel better. "Tell me exactly how close you went," he said after Michael described the vibration, the leaning posts, and the crack. "I stayed south of the fence." "Good. Keep it that way. Don't probe the ground, don't drive new posts near it, and don't let the animals enter any drainage line leading north." Michael sent the photographs and images of the map. David called back 13 minutes later. "The depression is close to a mapped ventilation passage. That doesn't prove the shaft has reopened, but the soil above it is saturated. If the old timber supports have failed, the surface may hold until it suddenly doesn't." Michael looked through the window at clouds accumulating over the western ridge. "When can you inspect it?" "A survey crew can be there tomorrow morning." "There's a storm coming tonight." "I know. Move every animal to the southernmost shelter. Stay out of low ground. If the crack grows and the access road remains passable, leave. If the road becomes unsafe, stay inside the southern zone and call emergency services." David paused. "And do not go looking for the mine entrance." "I wasn't planning to." "Most men say that before picking up a shovel." Michael called Thomas next. The old green pickup arrived less than an hour later, squeezing around a pine that had fallen partly across the lower road during the previous week's rain. Thomas climbed out wearing his patch jacket and carrying a steel thermos, but the humor left his face when he saw the survey ribbon. He studied the photographs and the old map at the kitchen table, then walked only as far as the southern barrier. "Your grandfather ever mention a mine?" Michael asked. Thomas rested both hands on his cane-free hips and looked toward the trees. "He mentioned bad ground. Said the north slope had swallowed 2 fence posts in the 70s. I thought he meant mud." His pale blue eyes settled on Michael. "Come down to my place tonight." "The animals can't." "The sheep can fit in the small trailer." Michael had already considered it. He backed the livestock trailer towards the lower road, but the fallen pine left too little space to turn safely. One wheel slipped toward the softened shoulder before Michael stopped. Walking 2 inexperienced sheep, 2 young dogs, and emergency supplies down a steep road in gathering wind would create a different danger. Thomas examined the road, then nodded toward the livestock shed. "Southern stall is stronger than the cabin. That's where they'll stay." "And you?" "Close enough to check them." Thomas stared at him in silence. Michael knew what the older man saw, a man accustomed to solving problems alone, even when doing so turned courage into foolishness. "I'll call before I act," Michael said, "not after you've already made the situation worse." "Before?" Thomas's expression eased slightly. "That may be the most unnatural sentence you've spoken since arriving." They spent the afternoon preparing for the storm. Thomas reinforced the inner stall gate while Michael added a second temporary panel across the entrance. They moved Rosie and June into the southern pen, spread dry straw, secured the feed bin, and checked every hinge. Rosie immediately tested the new enclosure with her nose and attempted to chew the rope tying one water bucket to the wall. June remained close behind her, ears turning toward each hammer strike. Daisy lay outside the stall, watching both sheep and occasionally glancing toward the northern trees. Cooper followed Michael from task to task until he discovered a folded feed sack beneath the porch. By the time Michael noticed, the young shepherd had dragged it halfway across the yard and was pulling backward with such determination that he appeared to be attempting to uproot the cabin. "Leave it," Michael said. Cooper pulled harder. Thomas leaned against the gate. "Useful emergency skill." "He's testing the structural integrity." Michael held out one hand. Cooper froze, considered his options, then released the sack and sat with complete innocence. The folded tip of his ear leaned forward. "He'll confess eventually," Thomas said, "not without legal counsel." The brief laughter disappeared when a gust rolled over the ridge and bent the upper branches toward the house. They cleared leaves from the southern drainage channel so rainwater would flow away from the shed rather than pool against its foundation. Michael carried tools, batteries, headlamps, rope, reflective clothing, a first aid kit, and a handheld radio into the cabin. Thomas watched him arrange each item in exact rows. "You always prepare for the worst?" "I prepare for what happens when other people don't." "Sounds exhausting." "It is." Thomas checked the final latch on the sheep pen, then looked toward the road. The sky had darkened before evening, pressing low over the hill like a lid. "My truck can still make it down," he said. "You can follow me." Michael looked toward Daisy, who had risen and was staring north again. Cooper sat beside the porch with the recovered feed sack now safely beyond reach. Inside the shed, Rosie pushed hay from the feeder while June stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Michael imagined driving away and returning to find the enclosure broken, the sheep loose, or the cabin damaged beyond repair. Beneath that practical fear was something more difficult to admit. He had spent years leaving before attachment could become responsibility. Now 4 animals depended on the choices he made, and departure no longer felt like safety. It felt like abandonment. "I'm staying," he said. Thomas did not argue, which made the decision feel heavier. "Then call me if anything changes." "I will." "Before you fix it." Michael met his eyes. "Before." Near dusk, Thomas eased the green pickup around the fallen pine and descended the southern road. Cooper ran beside the inner fence until the truck disappeared below the trees, then returned when Michael called him. The first drops arrived shortly after dark, large and widely spaced against the roof. Wind followed, moving through the forest in deep waves. Michael brought both dogs into the cabin but kept the sheep inside the more secure stall. Every 20 minutes he crossed the short distance beneath the porch roof to check them. On the first inspection, Rosie and June were dry and standing. On the second, the drainage ditch carried a steady stream southward, and the temporary barriers remained firm. Daisy accompanied Michael to the doorway each time, then stopped and turned her head toward the northern slope. Cooper stayed close until a loose tarp snapped against the shed wall. He jumped sideways, barked once, and then pretended he had intended to inspect the floor. By 11, the storm had erased everything beyond the nearest fence. Rain struck the windows in hard sheets. Branches scraped across the roof, and the cabin's old timbers complained beneath every gust. Michael had just checked the radio battery when a sharp crack split the night. It sounded like rifle fire, sudden and clean. He was already reaching for his raincoat when the heavier crash followed. The ground seemed to jump beneath the cabin. Daisy barked toward the livestock shed. Cooper rushed to the door. Michael clipped leads onto both dogs, pulled on his reflective shell, and ran into the rain. A mature pine had fallen beside the shed. Its trunk had missed the roof, but several thick branches had struck the auxiliary gate. One hinge had torn free, and the lower panel had twisted inward. Michael tied Daisy and Cooper to a secure post beneath the shed overhang, then entered the holding area. Rosie stood pressed against the inner wall, her cream fleece speckled with mud and leaves but showing no visible injury. She bleated sharply when Michael approached. "Easy," he said, running his hands over her legs and body. She was frightened, not hurt. The second corner of the pen was empty. "June." Michael checked behind the feeder, beneath the broken panel, and along the interior partition. No pale face appeared. On the splintered gate, a small patch of soft white wool clung to the wood. Outside, his headlamp found several narrow hoof prints filling rapidly with rain. They led away from the damaged enclosure, crossed the muddy yard, and curved toward the northern side of the hill. Daisy pulled against her lead, nose lifted into the storm. Cooper lowered his muzzle to the first print and began following it. Michael secured Rosie inside the reinforced inner stall, closed both latches, and tested them with his full weight. Then he looked beyond the survey ribbon, where darkness covered the old mine workings beneath the trees. From somewhere down the restricted slope came June's faint, frightened cry. It rose once through the storm and then stopped. June's cry vanished beneath the storm, leaving Michael with nothing but rain, darkness, and the narrow hoof prints dissolving in the mud. He returned to the cabin only long enough to gather what he needed: Over his work clothes, he pulled on a bright reflective rain shell so Thomas or a rescue crew could spot him through the trees. He clipped a first aid pouch to his belt, carried a coil of climbing rope across one shoulder, and placed the handheld radio inside the chest pocket of his jacket. A headlamp cast a hard white circle across the porch. Michael checked the batteries twice, then fastened long leads to Daisy and Cooper. The two young German shepherds stood differently beneath the rain. Cooper strained toward the broken gate, his black and tan body alive with nervous energy, while Daisy remained close to Michael's left side, her honey-gold face lifted toward the darkness where June had disappeared. Michael looked once towards the Northern Survey ribbon. David had told him not to enter the restricted ground. Thomas had made him promise to call before trying to solve anything alone. Michael understood both warnings. He also knew a 5-month-old lamb would not survive long on unstable ground in freezing rain. He took out his phone and sent Thomas a message. June, loose, tracking from safe side of drainage. Call rescue if I don't contact you in 10 minutes. The message remained unsent for several seconds before a single status mark appeared. Delivered. It was not the same as hearing Thomas's voice, but it was enough to keep Michael from feeling entirely cut off. Close, he told the dogs. Cooper lowered his nose to the hoof prints. Daisy watched Michael first, as though waiting to see whether he believed the path was safe. The tracks crossed the yard and entered the southern drainage channel before curving toward the restricted slope. Michael did not follow inside the ditch. He kept to the higher edge, testing each step before shifting his weight. Rain had blurred most of June's trail, but pale strands of wool caught on thorn branches and broken fence wire. Cooper found each one with impatient determination, sometimes pulling too quickly until Michael shortened the lead. Daisy moved more slowly. She paused whenever the soil changed beneath her paws, then looked back at Michael before continuing. The old mind map remained sharp in his mind. Ventilation lines, sealed shafts, unfinished passages beneath the hill. He had studied maps before missions until ink and contour became something almost physical. This map was different. The danger was not an enemy waiting behind a wall. It was the wall, the ground, and everything pretending to be solid. June cried again, weaker this time. Cooper surged forward. Easy. Michael's voice remained controlled, although the muscles along his jaw tightened. The sound came from below a stand of cedar where the drainage channel descended toward a shelf of land beyond the original fence line. Michael moved around the trees and stopped. A fresh opening had appeared in the slope. It was wider than the crack near the northern fence and black enough that the beam of Michael's headlamp seemed to disappear inside it. June stood on a narrow ledge beside the opening, trapped between a steep bank and the collapsed mouth of an old passage. Mud darkened her white fleece. Her long ears were flattened, and her legs remained spread for balance as water streamed around her hooves. Whenever she tried to turn, pieces of soil broke away and fell into the darkness. Michael backed both dogs several yards uphill. He chose a mature cedar whose thick roots emerged from firm ground and wrapped the dog's leads around the trunk. Daisy's line was fastened directly around the main base. Cooper's was looped around a broad root on the uphill side, far enough from the opening to keep him safe. Michael tested each connection with his full weight. Cooper barked toward June, but Daisy remained silent. Her eyes followed the water moving beneath Michael's boots. "Stay," he said. He tied one end of his climbing rope around the cedar, passed the other through the support loop on his belt, and approached the ledge from above. Instead of walking upright, he lowered himself onto one knee and spread his weight across the slope. Every instinct told him to move quickly. Training told him that urgency and haste were not the same thing. June saw him and gave a thin, frightened bleat. "Whoa, easy, girl." Michael extended one hand. The lamb's muzzle was only a few feet away. He could see mud trembling along the edges of her nostrils. He reached farther. His fingertips brushed wet wool. A deep crack sounded beneath him. Michael froze. The noise did not come from the opening ahead. It came from the earth under his knees. A thin line appeared across the mud and raced between his hands. He tried to push himself backward, but the ledge dropped before he could shift his weight. June vanished from view. The hillside folded inward, carrying Michael down a chute of mud, roots, and broken timber. His safety rope snapped tight around his waist and slowed the fall, but not before he struck the remains of an old ventilation chamber nearly 10 feet below. His left shoulder hit first. A rotted support beam rolled from the wall and dropped across his lower leg, pinning his ankle against the slope. Pain tore through his calf with such force that the chamber narrowed to a single white point. Michael clenched his teeth and refused to move. Loose soil continued sliding around him. Somewhere nearby, Daisy yelped. Her section of the edge had collapsed with him, and her lead had pulled tight around the cedar above, slowing her fall before she reached the deeper passage. She scrambled upright on the lower bank, mud covering her golden muzzle and chest. "Daisy!" His voice came out rougher than he intended. The shepherd turned instantly and crossed the short distance to him. She pressed against his shoulder while Michael examined himself in the order long practice demanded. Breathing clear, no obvious head injury. Both arms functional. The left ankle hurt, but the boot remained straight. He could still feel his toes. The beam was heavy, but it had not crushed the leg completely. He tried to shift it once. The timber moved less than an inch, and dirt poured from the wall behind it. Michael stopped. Force would bring more of the chamber down. June stood on another narrow shelf several feet across from him. The collapse had carried her lower, but had not thrown her into the deeper tunnel. Water flowed between them and disappeared behind a wall of broken supports. Her small body shook violently, yet she remained standing. Above the opening, Cooper barked in sharp, uneven bursts. His shape appeared briefly at the rim whenever lightning crossed the sky. Michael reached for the radio. Static filled the speaker. "County Rescue. This is Michael Bennett at the north slope of the Bennett property." Only static answered. He raised the radio toward the opening and tried again. The signal broke into fragments, then disappeared. The earth swallowed radio waves almost as effectively as it swallowed rain. Michael switched his headlamp to the emergency flash setting. Pulses of light revealed square-cut stone, black timber, and water beginning to collect around his trapped boot. Daisy touched her nose to his wrist. Michael realized his hand was trembling. "I'm all right," he whispered. The words were not true, but Daisy settled beside him as if accepting the promise provisionally. Each time pain forced his breathing too shallow, she nudged his wrist again. She had never been trained to do it. She simply refused to let his silence grow too deep. Above them, Cooper moved around the cedar. His barking suddenly changed position. Michael looked up and saw the lead dragging loose behind him. The root around which it had been looped had torn free from the softened soil, releasing the young dog without pulling him into the collapse. Cooper stood at the edge, rain streaming from his face, his folded ear flattened against his head. He leaned toward Daisy and whined. "Cooper!" The dog looked down. Michael remembered the games along the southern fence, the biscuits in Thomas's pocket, and the young shepherd running past the man he had been ordered to find. This was no enclosed yard. Thomas's farm lay down a dark, storm-covered trail. Fallen branches could block the way. Cooper could become frightened, lose the scent, or turn back toward Daisy. Michael's old instincts demanded a solution he could control. There was none. For the first time in years, his survival depended on trust rather than preparation. Not trust in a radio, rope, or trained rescue team. Trust in a young dog who still stole gloves and sometimes confused speed with purpose. Michael forced himself to raise one arm and point toward the southern slope. "Find Thomas." Cooper lowered his body but did not move. His eyes shifted from Michael to Daisy. The bond that had made Michael buy them both now held Cooper at the edge. Leaving must have felt like betrayal. Michael understood too well. "Cooper, find Thomas!" he shouted again. The dog stepped backward. For one terrible second, Michael thought fear had won. Then Cooper turned. His dark body crossed the headlamp beam once before disappearing between the trees. Michael listened to the rapid strike of paws against wet ground and the faint rattle of a collar tag moving downhill. The sound grew smaller, then vanished beneath the rain, leaving him unable to know whether Cooper was carrying the command toward help or had already become lost inside the storm. Cooper ran until the lights of the cabin disappeared behind the trees. Rain struck his face, filled his nostrils, and turned the southern trail into a river of mud. The 8-month-old German Shepherd had followed this route only twice before, both times in daylight and with Michael watching from the upper fence. Now thunder rolled through the forest, and each flash of lightning transformed familiar trees into white, twisted shapes. A fallen branch forced Cooper down the steep bank, where his paws slid beneath him and sent his body tumbling through wet leaves. He scrambled upright, shook once, and looked back toward the hill. Daisy was somewhere beneath that darkness. Every instinct pulled him toward her. For 8 months he had slept close enough to hear her breathing, followed when she moved, and cried when a crate door had threatened to carry her away. Turning back would have been the simplest choice. Then Michael's voice returned through the storm. "Find Thomas?" Cooper lowered his nose. Rain had nearly erased the older man's scent, but traces remained where Thomas's boots had pressed into the trail and where the tires of his green pickup had cut through the mud. Cooper began running again. Beneath the hill, Michael pulled Daisy's spare training line from beneath her wet chest. June stood on the opposite shelf, her pale legs shaking as water carried pieces of soil from beneath her hooves. Michael's trapped ankle had begun to throb in time with his heartbeat, and cold water had risen around the heel of his boot. He tied one end of the line to his belt, formed a wide loop with the other, and threw it toward the lamb. The first attempt struck the wall and fell short. The second passed over June's shoulders but slid away when she stepped backward. "Easy," Michael whispered, though his hands had begun to lose feeling. Daisy pressed her body against his side. Her warmth was small against the cold stone, but it gave him something solid to measure himself against. Michael gathered the line and threw again. This time the loop dropped across June's chest. The frightened lamb stepped through it, leaving the rope behind her front legs. Michael slowly tightened the line until it supported her without crushing her ribs. June struggled and bleated. "Better angry than gone," he said. Daisy touched her muzzle to his wrist when his eyes closed for half a second. Michael opened them immediately. Water continued gathering around the beam, pinning his leg. Cooper reached the lower bend and stopped. A large pine lay across the center of the road, its roots torn from the slope. Thomas's truck had passed around it earlier by using the narrow outer edge, but Cooper could not follow the tire marks without crossing a stream of runoff that had formed beside the trunk. He paced once, whining as thunder shook the ground. Then he climbed over the fallen tree. Bark tore beneath his claws, and one hind leg slipped between two branches. Cooper twisted free, dropped to the far side, and landed in mud deep enough to cover his paws. He kept moving. At the bottom of the hill, the trees opened around Thomas Reed's farmhouse, a low white building with a metal roof and a porch light burning above the door. Cooper struck the steps at full speed, collided with the door, and began scratching. Inside, Thomas had been standing beside the kitchen window with his phone in one hand and Michael's brief message still open on the screen. The 65-year-old farmer had not heard anything for more than 10 minutes. He had already put on his patched green jacket and boots, but the blocked road and worsening storm had made him hesitate between driving uphill alone and calling for help without knowing Michael's exact position. The scratching answered the question. Thomas opened the door. Cooper stumbled inside, soaked and shaking, a length of muddy lead dragging from his collar. "Where is he?" Thomas asked. Cooper seized the leg of Thomas's overalls, pulled toward the porch, then released him and barked. Thomas looked at the broken root still caught in the lead clip. His weathered face hardened. "All right, you found me." He called County Emergency Services and asked specifically for Sarah Mitchell's rescue unit. Sarah was 44, tall and lean, with wind-reddened fair skin, dark auburn hair braided tightly behind her head, and steady green eyes beneath strong brows. She had led mountain and mine rescues for 12 years, and the death of her younger brother in a winter climbing accident had left her intolerant of unnecessary delay but deeply patient with frightened families. Her voice remained even as Thomas described the abandoned mine, the unstable northern slope, and the missing lamb. "Do not approach the collapse alone," she ordered. "Mark the safest route and wait for us." Thomas looked at Cooper already running toward the truck. "I may have limited authority over the guide." Sarah's rescue vehicles met Thomas near the lower access road 15 minutes later. Floodlights cut through the rain as the team transferred ropes, ground anchors, medical equipment, and portable lighting into vehicles narrow enough to pass the fallen pine. Cooper paced beside Thomas's truck until the convoy began moving, then ran ahead whenever the road narrowed. Twice he stopped at forks and lowered his nose before choosing the path. Sarah watched him from the passenger seat, understanding that the young dog was not merely returning home. He was retracing terror. At the cabin, Rosie remained secured inside the southern stall, calling weakly for June. Cooper did not stop. He crossed the yard, passed the orange survey ribbon, and followed the higher side of the drainage channel. Thomas and the rescue team stayed behind him, placing marker lights along the safe route. Near the cedar stand, Cooper suddenly slowed. A rescue technician stepped toward a patch of ground that appeared firm beneath the grass. Cooper moved in front of him, stiff-legged, and released a low growl unlike any sound Thomas had heard from him before. "Hold," Sarah said. The technician stopped. A second later, the ground directly ahead broke away and slid into the opening, carrying stones and roots into the darkness. Cooper jumped backward but did not run. Sarah stared at the new edge, then at the trembling dog. "We follow him," she said, "and nobody steps where he refuses to step." The team established anchors on the uphill side and swept the chamber with lights. Michael's emergency headlamp flashed from below. "Michael!" Thomas shouted. A faint answer rose through the rain. Sarah knelt at the edge and assessed the visible walls before choosing Luis Ramirez to descend. Luis was 38, compact and powerfully built, with brown skin, short black hair, a broad, clean-shaven face, and dark eyes that remained gentle even when his voice became commanding. A former paramedic, he had joined technical rescue after losing a patient in a poorly supported trench collapse. Since then, he trusted equipment, procedure, and frightened animals only after checking all three himself. He clipped into the main line, tested every buckle, and descended with a medical bag and secondary rope. Luis reached Michael as another stream of soil poured from the wall. "I'm Luis. I'm getting all of you out." Michael pointed toward June, her first. Luis examined the lamb's position and attached a padded sling beneath the line Michael had placed around her. June struggled until Daisy gave one short bark across the chamber. The lamb froze long enough for Luis to secure the straps. The team lifted her through the opening, where Thomas wrapped her in a blanket and carried her toward the stall. Luis returned to Daisy, but the shepherd refused to step into the rescue harness. She pressed harder against Michael, amber eyes locked on his face. "She won't leave you," Luis said. Michael placed one hand against Daisy's muddy cheek. Part of him wanted to let her remain. Her warmth had become the wall between him and unconsciousness, yet the chamber had begun to groan, and keeping her beside him was no longer loyalty. It was danger. "Daisy, go!" She did not move. Michael forced his voice into the tone he had once used when hesitation could kill. "Go!" Daisy's ears lowered. She licked his wrist once, then allowed Luis to guide her into the harness. She rose through the shaft without taking her eyes from Michael until darkness separated them. The water around Michael's boot climbed another inch. Luis placed an inflatable lifting bag beneath the beam while the team above tightened a secondary line around Michael's chest. "When this moves, the wall may follow," Luis warned. Michael nodded. The bag expanded slowly. The timber lifted just enough for Luis to pull Michael's leg free. Pain burned through the ankle, but the boot remained aligned. Luis secured it in a temporary splint and attached Michael to the hall system. As they began rising, a sound like distant thunder moved through the chamber. It came from behind the collapsed passage, growing louder as trapped water forced its way through old rock and timber. Sarah shouted for the team to increase speed. Luis and Michael cleared the edge together. Rescuers dragged them across the marked safe zone just as water burst through the wall below. The opening exhaled mud, broken boards, and freezing spray. The remaining shelf collapsed, and the chamber where Michael had lain disappeared into roaring darkness. On the southern side of the barrier, Daisy tore free from Thomas's grip and ran toward the stretcher. Cooper followed more cautiously, exhausted legs trembling beneath him. Michael lay beneath a thermal blanket, his face pale with cold and rain. He reached down first to Daisy, touching the wet fur between her ears. Then his hand found Cooper's folded ear. The young dog leaned into his palm and closed his eyes. Michael looked at both of them, his voice barely stronger than the storm. Both came back. Michael woke beneath white hospital lights with his left ankle wrapped, his body heavy from exhaustion, and the taste of cold metal still lingering in his mouth. The doctors had found no fracture, only a severe sprain, deep bruising, and mild hypothermia. His shoulder would ache for weeks, but nothing had been permanently damaged. The news should have brought relief. Instead, his first clear thought was of Daisy and Cooper. He remembered Daisy rising through the rain in the rescue harness, her amber eyes fixed on him until the darkness separated them. Then he remembered Cooper's folded ear beneath his hand and the 4 quiet words he had whispered before the stretcher carried him away. Both came back. Thomas had remained at the hill after the ambulance left. He moved Rosie and June into his own reinforced barn until county engineers finished evaluating the southern buildings, then brought Daisy and Cooper to his farmhouse below the slope. The 2 dogs were safe, fed, and uninjured apart from shallow cuts on Cooper's paws and bruising along Daisy's chest. Yet Thomas discovered that safety did not mean peace. He spread a clean wool blanket beside the stove for Daisy, but she ignored it and curled around Michael's mud-stained rain jacket instead. The coat smelled of wet soil, mine water, and the man she had refused to leave. Each time Thomas attempted to move it closer to the warmth, Daisy opened her eyes and rested one paw across the sleeve. Cooper chose the front door. He lay with his black and tan body pressed against the threshold, his folded ear lifting whenever tires moved along the county road. A delivery truck made him rise. A passing farm vehicle sent him to the porch. Each time, he watched until the sound faded, then returned to the door without touching the food Thomas had placed nearby. "He didn't leave you," Thomas told them one evening, though Daisy and Cooper only watched him. "The man is too stubborn to leave properly." The joke did not make the farmhouse feel lighter. Thomas had spent much of his life pretending concern was simply another kind of work. He repaired gates, carried feed, drove people to appointments, and left tools on porches so no one could thank him directly. Waiting beside 2 silent dogs exposed the truth beneath those habits. He had become afraid of losing Michael long before the hill opened. Michael remained in the hospital for 3 days. He disliked the helplessness of the bed, the plastic bracelet around his wrist, and the way every hallway sound arrived before the person making it. Linda Parker called twice. Her usually composed voice had grown softer, though she still avoided pity. Frank Miller called once and began by asking whether Michael intended to make a habit of purchasing dogs and then forcing them to organize rescue operations. Michael replied that Cooper's management style lacked discipline. Frank laughed, but the sound broke briefly at the end. Thomas refused to describe the dogs in emotional terms. "They're eating," he said. Eventually, Michael heard the pause. "Cooper's still at the door. Only when he isn't stealing my socks." That answer was meant to reassure him, but Michael knew Thomas well enough now to hear what had not been said. On the 3rd morning, the doctor approved his discharge with crutches, strict instructions to keep weight off the ankle, and several warnings about returning too quickly to physical work. Michael listened with the respectful expression of a man already negotiating privately with every rule. Thomas drove him back toward the hill beneath a pale, cold sky washed clean by the storm. County vehicles occupied the lower road, and bright barriers marked the northern boundary. Engineers had filled the newly opened shaft with stabilized material, redirected surface water, and installed permanent fencing well south of the unstable ground. The cabin, livestock shed, southern pasture, and access road had been inspected and declared safe. The north slope would remain closed indefinitely. Michael watched the warning signs pass outside the truck window. Once, losing part of the property would have felt like failure. Now, it felt like survival given a shape. Thomas stopped near the cabin. Before Michael could fully open the passenger door, Cooper appeared from beside the porch. The young shepherd raced across the yard, mud flying behind him. Michael braced himself for the impact, but Cooper stopped less than a foot from the crutches. His front paws slid forward, his chest lowered, and a high, wounded sound escaped him. He wanted to jump, but seemed to understand that Michael could not catch him. Michael lowered one hand. Cooper pressed his head beneath it, trembling so hard that his collar tag rattled. Daisy approached more slowly. She had always measured distance before crossing it, and even joy could not erase her careful nature. Her honey-gold coat had been cleaned, though one dark stain remained near her shoulder where the mine mud had worked deep into the fur. She stopped in front of Michael, searched his face, then stepped between the crutches and pressed her forehead against his chest. Michael rested his chin above her ears. Neither dog barked. Neither demanded anything. They simply leaned into him as if confirming that the shape they had waited for was real. For most of his adult life, Michael had returned to empty rooms. No light had been left on for him. No footsteps had crossed a floor because his truck entered a driveway. He had called that freedom because the alternative would have required admitting how much it hurt. Now, Cooper stood against his uninjured leg. Daisy remained beneath his hand, and Thomas waited nearby, pretending to inspect the porch railing. Michael understood that the dogs had not believed he abandoned them. They had expected him to return. Their certainty frightened him more than loneliness ever had, because it gave him something precious enough to lose. It also gave him a reason to stay. Rosie and June returned to the hill 2 days later. June carried no lasting injury, though she avoided the northern side of any enclosure and remained close to Rosie whenever rain began. County workers completed a permanent barrier around the closed ground, and David Collins personally confirmed that the southern structures remained outside the mapped workings. Frank arrived the following week in an aging brown truck, his hickory cane appearing before the rest of him as he climbed out. His white hair had been flattened by the drive, and his heavy mustache lifted when Cooper ran toward him. Daisy followed, but stopped several steps away, watching until Frank lowered himself carefully beside her. He rested one weathered hand against her neck. "You remember me?" Daisy leaned into the touch. Frank's eyes shone, though he looked toward the cabin before the emotion could become visible for too long. Cooper stole his glove while everyone was distracted. "Still a criminal," Frank said. "Now with rescue credentials," Michael replied. Frank watched the two dogs move around the yard, Daisy checking the fence while Cooper attempted to persuade Rosie to surrender a piece of straw. "I thought they needed someone who could give them work," he said. "Turns out they needed someone who needed them back." That evening, Michael opened the final envelope from his grandfather's wooden box. The paper had yellowed, and the handwriting pressed deeply into every line. His grandfather wrote that pride often disguised itself as independence, because independence sounded stronger than fear. He warned that a man could become so accustomed to an empty house that he might mistake silence for peace. A house, the letter said, did not become a home when its roof was repaired or its walls stood straight. It became a home when someone inside listened for another person's return. Michael read the final paragraph twice. The old man had not left the hill as an inheritance of land. He had left Michael one last opportunity to belong somewhere before solitude became permanent. Months passed. Winter settled gently over Wallace, whitening the southern pasture and sealing the closed mine beneath layers of frost. Daisy grew into a calm guardian who noticed changes in the animals before anyone else. She walked the safe fence every morning, paused at the permanent northern barrier, and returned when Michael called. Cooper learned to guide Rosie and June through the pasture with surprising restraint, though he still moved too quickly when excited and continued stealing gloves with the dedication of a professional thief. Michael eventually stopped buying replacements in matching pairs. Thomas drove up most mornings with coffee strong enough to wake the dead and always claimed he had made too much by accident. Linda visited for dinner in early spring and found curtains over the windows, photographs on the wall, and 4 chairs around the repaired table. Frank called each Sunday, asking first about the dogs and only later about Michael. The cabin no longer smelled of abandonment. It smelled of pine smoke, warm bread, sheep wool, damp paws, and ordinary life. Michael had once believed he saved two young dogs from being separated beneath a feed store awning. The truth was more humbling. When the hill opened beneath him, Daisy saved him by staying close enough to keep him awake. Cooper saved him by finding the courage to leave the two beings he loved most and carry their need into the storm. One had taught Michael that loyalty could mean remaining in darkness. The other had taught him that trust sometimes meant letting someone run beyond his sight and believing they would return. The cabin was no longer a place where an old soldier had come to disappear. It had become a home where three once lonely lives learned that returning was not simply reaching a familiar place. It was finding someone who had been listening for your footsteps all along. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as thunder, light, or answers from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, on muddy paws, through a loyal heart that stays beside us, or through one soul willing to run into the storm for help. Michael believed he was rescuing Daisy and Cooper, but God used their love to rescue the part of him that had forgotten how to trust, belong, and come home. In daily life, we may feel abandoned, exhausted, or unseen, yet grace often appears through acts of kindness, friendships, and the courage to let others stand with us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about the person or animal who helped you through a dark season, and subscribe for more stories of faith, healing, and loyalty. May God protect you, comfort your family, and guide each step you take.